Hello, noble ones, and welcome to Metatron's Academy. Thank you so much for being curious and asking really cool questions. So, today's question is the following. Is there a physical limit to the number of languages that a human being can learn throughout their lives? In other words, is there a memory limitation when it comes to our brain in connection to languages? In order to answer this question professionally, we have to really reframe it in our mind first and foremost. Because oftentimes when we ask this question, this really is in relation to the way our computers work. Our computers have a set amount of space for the data that we store in them, whether it be through a hard disk or whether it be solid state drive, whatever it is. We know that we have a set amount of space, and once that space is filled, we can't fit anything else anymore. And in fact, if anything, we need to rewrite stuff. So is that how our brain works? Is there a set number of languages or space dedicated to language control and retention in our brain? And what happens if we fill? So imagine that I learn 50 languages, 80 languages, whatever the number is, and then if I want to learn the 81st language, is it going to overwrite another language? Obviously not. Now, the reality is that our brains, they're different. Of course, computers are electronic brains, but our brains are really different. And one thing that we can say is that scientists haven't found an actual limit to the number of languages that we could theoretically learn. There is no limit as far as we understand. However, there are practical constraints. So let's discuss these. Alright, already when we're talking about memory capacity, we have to consider that it is theoretically vast. The human brain can store an enormous amount of information, far more than any individual has ever filled with languages. The bigger challenge is in fact maintenance. Languages require active use to remain fluent. Without regular practice, even native languages can deteriorate, a phenomenon called language attrition. But really, our greatest practical constraint is time. Learning a language to fluency typically takes a certain amount of time depending on the language and your starting point. Even if you lived for 100 years and started learning languages at age 5, you'd have maybe 95 years to work with. That is, if everything goes perfectly, and of course your ability to learn these languages would deteriorate with time. But it does put an upper bound somewhere, and eventually you'll run out of time. So, in other words, rather than a memory capacity, it really is a matter of time. If a human could live, hypothetically, for hundreds and hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, who knows what number of languages that human could become proficient in? But the reality of fact is that, of course, having a limited amount of time, then the number of languages that we can realistically store in our brain and learn is directly proportional to that. For example, in a future reality, humans start to live up to 200 years thanks to improvement into medicine and whatnot, and of course that number would increase. But it is also likely that if technology goes up tremendously, then we'll find other ways to learn languages, perhaps through neuralware and whatnot, rather than actually memorizing them directly with traditional ways like we do today. But that's for a different video. Another thing we should discuss is the concept of cognitive interference, which becomes an issue with many languages. Your brain starts confusing similar vocabulary, grammar patterns, and pronunciations. Multilingual individuals, me included, often report that closely related languages, for instance Spanish and Italian, interfere with each other than more distant ones. I do have, however, to give you a caveat with that. If you are native of one of these languages, the amount of interference is negligible. If you're not, however, and you try to learn two languages that are closely related, particularly before having reached at least fluency in one of the two, consolidated fluency in fact, that level of overlap may cause problems when it comes to your ability to speak this language. Now, given we haven't really chosen what kind of parameter to define when it comes to learning a language when we're trying to come up with this number, and that's probably one of the hardest areas of this in order to make it professional. What do you mean by learn a language? Is being mildly conversational fine, lower intermediate, upper intermediate? You have to be fluent. What do you mean by fluent? Does it have to be C2? So there is a lot that we would have to discuss, and that would influence the actual number that we would come up with. So unless we have our premises consolidated, it's difficult to really do an assessment that makes sense. But since all of this is hypothetical anyways, I don't think we should spend too much time into that, and instead discuss more the practical problems that you could have to run towards that limit the number of languages we would be able to reach as a human being. Health is another thing. Or if you get shot, of course, that severely reduces the number of languages. So there are a lot of external factors that deal with it, rather than having to discuss a matter of actual memory allocation and space. And the more you look into this, the more you'll realize that that is indeed the least of our problems as a species. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much. Alright, speculation is fun, but let's have a look at some real-world examples. To get a sense of possible limitations, we have to imagine this. The most accomplished, and I'm using this word with caution here, polyglots, typically speak between 15 to 30 languages, however, with varying degrees of proficiency. Enormous caveat. So, while there are a few individuals that claim to be able to speak 50 languages, a lot of the times they are absolute frauds, so there is that. But even if, scientifically speaking, is it even possible to hit 50 languages? There are a few articles online that do state that there are some linguists that believe that fluency, and I'll get back to this word, may be reached and maintained for about 10 to even maybe 20 languages, and then you can add an extra number of languages in which you have very basic conversational levels. Thing is though, once again, this number can be stretched depending on what definition you give to the word fluency. If by fluency you simply mean that you can have a little bit of an easy conversation in a non-professional scenario or non-academic environment, excusing horrible pronunciation, grammar mistake, and generally speaking a relatively unimpressive level, then yeah, you could probably stretch that number pretty high. The reality is though that the way, for example, I tend to use the word fluent is to mean someone who is fairly advanced. It doesn't have to be like an exceptional specialist, because obviously a specialist, so someone who simply decides to dedicate their entire life into learning and perfecting one foreign language, they will always be superior in knowledge, pronunciation, competence, and proficiency compared to someone who decides to instead reach fluency in 5 languages. However, to me, for the expression fluent to make even sense, it needs to be someone that when you hear them speak, you are impressed. The pronunciation is really good. Not necessarily native-like, but it needs to be really good. They sound very competent. Their grammar is almost impeccable. The vocabulary choice is really good, even from the perspective of a native. So in that case, of course, once we use that parameter, which is the only one that makes sense when discussing fluency, unless you're trying to push or sell something and pretend and so be a fraud, if that's the parameter we're using, then I'd say that 20 languages is going to be impossible, and in fact the number is going to be dependent on a lot of situations that once again don't have to do with your brain synapses, have to do with your specific life conditions. Can you dedicate your entire life, every day, all day, to language learning? Then you're probably very wealthy, or you found a way to make a career out of it. But then again, it is very situational, and unless we define first exactly, possibly with the, for example, European frame of reference, what fluent means, we cannot give that number. And in fact, giving that number can be dangerous because it can create a breeding ground for frauds. We don't have a precise number, and whatever approximate number that we come up with really has to do with how you define knowing a language. If it's fluency you're talking about, even the most exceptional individuals, the number is still going to be relatively low. And then if you consider, a little bit of knowledge of multiple languages, well then of course we can come up with more impressive numbers. But does it mean anything at that point? Well, I'll leave that question with you. And as always, thank you very much for joining Metatron's Academy. Stay curious.